Hello, hello, and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. I am Greg, here today to do a comparison of the movie and the film The Shining. It's been a while since I did one of these. I previously did If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin. I will link that down below. And I did the TV show Fosse Verdon, which was based by Sam Watson's biography, Fosse. I will link that one down below as well. I'm looking forward to trying to do some more of these in 2020. I find them really interesting. In college, I took a class on literature into film. It was all about adaptations, and I just find that process really fascinating. So this is going to be a big one because there are a lot of differences between the movie and the book. So I'm not going to cover everything. I'm not going to get into all the nitty-gritty details. I'm really just going to cover the big differences. Also, I am going to be using, I took notes. I created a post for my website, supposedlyfun.com, which I will also link down below if you want to refer to that as well. I have it in front of me. I'm going to refer to it. Forgive me. I will try not to stare at it too much, but it's going to happen a little bit because there's a lot to cover. Published in 1977, The Shining was Stephen King's third novel. Stephen King's first novel was Carrie, and it was an immediate success. The film adaptation made it an even bigger success, so it's really no surprise that there was such a fervor for both the new book by Stephen King and a film adaptation, which followed 3 years after its publication date in 1980. The movie was directed by celebrated film director Stanley Kubrick, and while it was not initially a success with both audiences or critics, over time it has evolved into a bona fide classic. So you would think that Stephen King would be really happy about the success of The Shining as a film in addition to the book. However, you would be wrong. Stephen King has been very outspoken over the years about just how much he absolutely hates the adaptation of The Shining. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of why, but basically it comes down to a lot of the departures that happen from the page to the screen and the ways in which they change the tone of the novel and what Stephen King was intending to do with it. The basics of the story are the same in both. The Torrance family agrees to look after the Overlook Hotel after it closes for the season. The Overlook Hotel is in the mountains of Colorado, and in the winter, you can't get to it. It's completely impassable due to snow. But because of the repairs that are necessary in the spring, they have found it more useful to hire a caretaker, someone to stay at the hotel through the winter season and look after it. But they are completely isolated while they are there in the winter. The father, Jack Torrance, is an aspiring writer who is struggling to stay sober. The family is at a bit of a crucial point. There's been a lot of tension, a lot of really upset feelings because Jack broke Danny's arm. Danny is his son, in a fit of drunken anger. And he was, after getting sober, he allowed his temper to come out again and beat a student and was fired from his job. That son, Danny, has a unique power, sort of an extrasensory ability that comes to be called The Shining, hence the title. Unfortunately, Danny's shine is telling him that the Overlook is a really dangerous place, and it seems to be hungry for the Torrance family. So that's the premise of the book. Before getting into a lot of the nitty-gritty, let's talk about the inspiration of the novel, because I think that informs a lot of what Stephen King was intending to do and how the movie begins to depart from that. So after the publication of Stephen King's first two books, Carrie and Salem's Lot, Stephen King was looking for a change of pace. Obviously, at that point, it was still very early in Stephen King's career. He hadn't really leaned into the world building that he would ultimately do in the fictional towns of Derry and Castle Rock, which have come to define his career in a lot of ways. At this point in his career, he wanted to do something different. So he opened up an atlas and just pointed, and Colorado is the location that he randomly selected. So he and his wife went to Colorado and ended up spending a night at the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park. It turned out it was the last night that the hotel was going to be open before they closed for the winter. So Stephen King and his wife were the only two guests in the entire hotel. And as they walked around this old hotel, which is still open, by the way, and trades off of its reputation for being haunted, especially because it inspired The Shining, Stephen King got the idea that it would be the perfect setting for a ghost story. This might give you the idea that the supernatural element of The Shining was the driving force behind its creation, but that's only part of the story. What really formed the idea of The Shining was that Stephen King had a nightmare that very night in which his son, who was only 3 years old at the time, was running terrified through the halls of that hotel, being chased by a fire hose that had come to life. This brought out Stephen King's own fears as a parent, not only that his child would be harmed, but that he would be the one to do the harm to his child. This is important because it's notable that for King, the driving force behind the story was only partially the ghosts. For him, it's really about a fractured family, and in particular, a man's struggle to control his own demons and be a good father and husband. Now, incidentally, the fire hose from Stephen King's dream does appear as a malevolent force in the book, but does not appear at all in the movie. Now that we've covered the inspiration behind the book, let's look at let's start getting into the big difference and talk about some daddy issues, because the main problem that Stephen King has with the movie is the way it portrays the character of Jack Torrance, the father of the book. And the ways in which that character is changed reveal the fundamental differences between the book and the movie. And it starts with the casting of Jack Nicholson as Jack Torrance. Stephen King objected to it leading up to the production of the film. He suggested Jon Voight, among other people, as replacements for Jack Nicholson, who he thought had too much intensity for the part. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about Jack Torrance in the novel first. On the page, Jack is essentially a normal guy, albeit a man who really enjoys his privilege in life as a white man, and he feels entitled to success. He has a bit of a temper problem, but as long as he's not drinking, it's not so much of a problem. He can control it. Alcohol is really the thing that tips him over into rage. Getting sober, both the process of getting sober and the process of staying sober, has been a really harsh reality check for the book's Jack Torrance. He is being forced to learn that the world isn't just going to give him what he wants. He needs to put in just as much effort into being a good writer and a good father and a good husband as the next person. And while he does occasionally feel resentful about that, by and large, he genuinely wants to do better and be a better person. Now, I'm not an expert on Stephen King and his struggles with addiction throughout his life, but he certainly has struggled with addiction throughout his adult life, and that has seeped into his writing in many ways. In my review of the book The Shining, which I will also link down below in the description box, I mentioned that the book Misery is informed by Stephen King's struggles to get sober, because the character of, I believe Paul is the name of the writer in that book, as he tries to wean himself off of the painkillers that Annie has gotten him hooked on, that is deliberately, directly informed by Stephen King's struggles to get sober. You can see it at work in The Shining, even though he didn't, his family staged an intervention that caused him to officially get sober in the late 80s, roughly 10 years after this book was published. It is very much, as I said, a novel about a man trying to rise above his demons. And temper is a key component of this. Jack isn't just struggling to stay sober, he's struggling with anger and resentment, which can be just as potent as alcohol. King has also stated that after becoming a father, he was alarmed by how easily he could become angered by his children. Like, he would be trying to work and they would come interrupt him, they would be making messes in the house, and he was alarmed by how this could happen even when they were very young, and how that when that anger was combined with alcohol, it often led to incidents of really just terrifying, unprovoked rage. He was terrified of letting that anger get the best of him, even as he continued to struggle with alcohol and substance abuse over time. So I think it's important to understand that when Stephen King expresses dissatisfaction with Kubrick's movie, it isn't necessarily arrogance or ego. It's that The Shining is a work that has really deeply personal meaning to him. And unfortunately, this inspiration is where the movie does the most disservice to its source material. Now, as I said, King's problems with the adaptation of The Shining begin with the casting of Jack Nicholson. And Nicholson absolutely brings his natural intensity full bore into the role of Jack Torrance. Whether that is deliberate on the part of Nicholson or if it was the result of decisions that he and Kubrick made in collaboration with each other, I don't know. But the end result is that Stephen King watches the movie of The Shining and feels that Jack Torrance is already a crazy person when he shows up at the Overlook. And I don't think that's necessarily an unfair interpretation. In the movie, the hotel and its ghosts don't necessarily manipulate Jack Torrance into a downward spiral so much as they give him just a slight little nudge to embrace something that was already there in the first place. Now, you could argue that this is a sort of cinematic shorthand because it's really difficult for a movie to give the same sense of interiority that you can get in a character in a book. A movie has to make sacrifices not only for the running time of the film, but they have to make a lot of sacrifices in anything that could be complicated to make sure that the audience is able to get the gist of things without getting bogged down in a lot of detail. It's not exactly a fair comparison, but you can think of how silent film stars really overact the emotion on their face in order to give the audience a sense of what their character is feeling without using words. It's kind of similar to that, I think, but it's not just that when it comes to The Shining. The shorthand that the movie uses for the character of Jack really alters the character in a very deliberate way. Those alterations reveal a larger and more fundamental difference of opinion in what the story of The Shining is. On the one hand, Stephen King's book is really the story of a fractured family told in the framework of a supernatural thriller. On the other hand, Stanley Kubrick's movie is a supernatural thriller told in the framework of a fractured family. They're putting the focus on two drastically different areas, which changes the tone and the meaning of the project completely. And I will say that Jack's centrality to the story and what the hotel wants is another huge difference between the book and the movie, but I will get to that later. I will say that the difference in both the tone and the subject of the movie and in the character of Jack really comes to a head and is perfectly illustrated in the respective finales. On the page, Jack Torrance fights his way through the madness long enough to allow Wendy and Danny to escape, leaving himself to perish. More on that later. In the exploding hotel. In the movie, Wendy and Danny escape despite Jack's continued efforts to kill them, and Jack freezes to death, unredeemed and alone. It really doesn't get more stark than that. In the book, the father has a bit of a redemptive moment and becomes a hero. In the movie, he's just a bad guy. So we've covered the daddy issues. Let's talk about some mommy issues, because King's problems with the movie of The Shining don't just end with the treatment of the character of Jack. He also takes issue with the way Jack's wife, Wendy, is portrayed in the movie. Now, on the page, Wendy is an every person, sort of like Jack is on the page. She's also prone to some archetypal, read stereotypical, characterizations. As such, in the book, she is a housewife and a mother with no real aspirations of her own outside of her family. And that's true of the movie as well. You can tell that she was written by a male writer in many respects, but in casual ways. In the book, she does display her own sense of agency, and she emerges as a much more complicated character. She seriously contemplates divorce through all of the problems that she has with Jack, particularly after he breaks Danny's arm, but ultimately she tries to keep her family together. And King has the sense to make his reader know that Wendy doesn't do this out of codependency so much as fear. Fear of disapproval for leaving the role that society has given her. I mean, sure, but that's mostly subtext. The reader brings that out themselves. It's not anything that King is overtly stating. And I would just say, remember, in 1977, when this book was published, divorce was still a controversial subject. The movie Kramer versus Kramer came out and won Best Picture at the Oscars 2 years later. There was furor over the TV character Rhoda Morgenstern getting a divorce, which caused the show to lose most of its audience and eventually get canceled roughly around the same time as this. So divorce was becoming more common, but there was still a stigma attached to it at the time. More overtly, Wendy is afraid of failure. Still recovering from a vaguely defined, clearly abusive, but not really understood how relationship with her mother, Wendy is really determined to prove her worth in the world. Even more overtly, Wendy is very aware that if she leaves Jack, she's going to be left exposed and vulnerable, and she will have nowhere to go and no income of her own, and her only recourse will be to move in with the mother that she hates. I'm not sure how intentional it was for King to plot out Wendy as a casualty of a woman's place in society in 1970s America, given how prone he is to sexualizing Wendy and viewing her in what is now understood to be the perspective of the patriarchy. But he deserves credit for making her a complex character that at least hints at these larger themes, including the problematic idea that a woman was viewed as nothing without a man and didn't have a place or agency without a man, even though Wendy on the page does have resolve. She's also repeatedly referred to as attractive, or as a woman whose, for lack of a better word, assets get noticed by the men who are around her. And given how defining the movie has been, it's hard to see Wendy that way at all, because Kubrick, who famously tormented actress Shelley Duvall, who played Wendy, made Wendy appear frumpy and frail. She wears kind of dowdy clothing, kind of really bland and colorless. The movie's Wendy is a far cry from the attractive, confident, and resilient woman who appears on the page. And in that note, known for being a perfectionist, Kubrick drove the entire cast and crew of The Shining to exhaustion, but he was particularly aggressive and unforgiving with Shelley Duvall, who has struggled to reconcile her experience with making this film with her entire life ever since. It's no surprise then that the Wendy you see in the movie is meek and submissive and skittish. She appears beaten down and afraid all the time, and she looks exhausted. She's prone to hysterics, and her character is flat and one-dimensional. And finally, on this section, in the novel, Danny is a daddy's boy. He loves his father. He adores his father. And part of that, I think, is that there's a sense that he feels like he needs to save his father from his demons, which is actually astute on Stephen King's part. In the novel, Danny has a much deeper and closer relationship with Wendy, and he seems to fear his father, which does make sense as well. But the switch allows the Jack in the movie to feel that he is being ganged up on or excluded when things start to go down. And since we brought up Danny, let's talk about him a little bit. He probably changes the least in the journey from the page to the screen, but there are still differences. In the movie, he is portrayed as a normal kid who happens to have these talents and abilities. In the book, his talents and abilities get played out a little bit more specifically, and he is hyper intelligent and observant, and that is remarked on a lot, and there are a lot of examples of it. But the biggest difference in the character of Danny relates to his imaginary friend, Tony. The movie doesn't do much to explain Tony at all. And by the way, the movie invents the whole finger thing where Tony speaks like this. The book works very hard to make it clear that Tony is a manifestation of Danny's own subconscious. He gives Danny's powers an outlet when he is too young to understand that he has these powers, and as he gets older and closer to the Overlook Hotel, Tony's role changes, and instead of becoming an outlet for his powers, he becomes the source of uncomfortable truths or visions that Danny would rather not deal with. It's kind of like the classic, largely outdated explanation for multiple personalities, which is now not even called multiple personalities, it's dissociative identity disorder. And this is further revealed when, at the end of the book, you find out that Danny's middle name is Anthony. So I think the differences in the characters give you a sense of the drastically different approaches to the tone and to the subject matter. Let's talk about the ending, because this is huge. And let's start with the movie, because the movie's ending is a lot more simple, at least to explain. In the movie, Jack attacks his family and murders Dan Halloran, who has just arrived back at the hotel after Danny called him for help. I haven't explained his character. If you're unfamiliar, Dan Halloran was the cook at the Overlook Hotel. He'd worked there for several years. He has shining, and he recognizes Danny's ability to shine. So he tells Danny before leaving the hotel that if he runs into trouble to call him. Danny does, and Halloran works his way back to the Overlook in both the book and the movie. But in the movie, as soon as he arrives, he is murdered by Jack Torrance. Anyway, Jack attacks his family. Danny manages to lose his father in the hedge maze, more on the hedge maze later, and he escapes with his mother in Halloran's vehicle. Jack freezes to death, and before the movie fades to black, we see an old photograph in the hotel that appears to have Jack Torrance in the forefront of the photo, even though it was taken before his lifetime. Significantly, the Overlook Hotel is still standing. And as I said, the novel is much more complex and totally different in tone and outcome. The hotel has this outdated boiler in the book that is in its own entire subplot in the book, and that's excised almost completely from the movie. I believe in the movie, As they're getting a tour of the hotel, someone tells Jack that they're going to show him the boiler room, and that's about it. But in the book, it is explained that the boiler needs to be attended to regularly, or the whole place is going to blow up because it's old and they haven't replaced it. So when we get to the final confrontation, Jack critically forgets about the boiler while he's losing his mind and chasing his family around trying to kill them. Danny reminds him of his error, and the good Jack Torrance manages to fight his way out long enough to allow Wendy and Danny to escape before the hotel blows up, leaving himself to perish with the hotel. Except that in the book, Jack is likely already a ghost by the time that happens. Because when Wendy and Jack are fighting, Wendy stabs Jack, and it's implied that she kills him pretty overtly. She stabs him, he recovers from the wound and tells her, "You killed me," and then keeps coming after her. Is Jack crazy, or was he really killed and then brought back as his body was revived as a ghost by the hotel? I think the book gives us every reason to believe that he's telling the truth when she says that she killed him. This, of course, allows the hotel to fully take over him and make him homicidal until Danny manages to bring the good Jack back out, that is. So in the book, Jack dies and becomes a hotel ghost that chases his family and Halloran around. But Halloran survives and saves the day by getting Danny and the badly injured Wendy out of the hotel before it explodes and then back down the mountain. But before they go down the mountain, he needs to stop at a tool shed for extra gas. And while they are there, the hotel's ghosts make a last-ditch attempt to manipulate Halloran into killing Wendy and Danny, and he manages to shake it off before they leave. And this implies that the hotel's bad juju still exists even without the hotel standing. Now, incidentally, I'm going to get into some spoilers for the sequel to The Shining, Dr. Sleep, which I have not read, but I have seen the movie. And what I find, so the production of the movie of Dr. Sleep was a fraught project, because obviously Stephen King hated the movie adaptation of The Shining. And his book, Dr. Sleep, follows the plot of his novel and the way his novel ended. The film adaptation assumes the chronology of Kubrick's film, which means that in the movie, Halloran is a ghost and the Overlook Hotel is still standing. As you can imagine, King was not thrilled that the movie picked up the plot points from Kubrick's film instead of his book. And what's interesting about the movie of Dr. Sleep is that it basically has the original ending of The Shining as its own ending. Obviously, spoilers for Dr. Sleep if you don't want them, but in the movie Dr. Sleep, Danny stands in for Jack. He saves the life of a young girl who has even more powerful shining abilities than he does, and he dies saving her in the Overlook Hotel, which doesn't exist in the book. I think I read that the book takes place on the grounds of the old Overlook Hotel, picking up on that implication that the hotel's ghosts survive even beyond the existence of the hotel. But so Danny is killed by the hotel's ghosts and chases this girl. She manages to bring Danny, like the good Danny, back out long enough for him to let her escape the hotel. And the boiler comes back into it because he's primed the boiler, it's ready to explode. The hotel explodes at the end of the movie Dr. Sleep. Now, obviously, since I haven't read the book, I can't say how that compares to whatever happens in here. Maybe this will be an adaptation comparison somewhere down the road. I don't know when, but sometime. Anyway, let's talk about motivation, because this is another key place where the book and the movie are different. In the novel, it is made very clear that the hotel and its ghosts are ultimately using Jack to get to Danny. Danny is what they really want. And even when Jack is starting to lose his mind, both Wendy and Danny try to tell him the hotel is using him, and he doesn't believe them. Basically, Danny has that uniquely powerful shine to him. The hotel wants to absorb it into itself. Halloran observes that Jack has something inside him, some kind of a shine, but it's buried so deeply that its nature is undetectable to him. And since this never comes to light, I think it feels reasonable to assume that this is merely the device through which the hotel's ghosts are able to reach Jack and manipulate him. Now, why the hotel has never tried to absorb Halloran, who worked there for some time before Danny shows up, is never adequately explained in either the book or the movie. So all we can do is chalk it up to a plot hole. You could argue that his power isn't significant enough for the hotel to really catch on to it or care, but I don't think that really makes sense. I think that argument is much better suited to the really unnamed characters in the book that are referred to like hotel employees or guests who have enough of a shining ability to see ghosts or pick up on the weird things that are going on, but they don't understand what's happening. Halloran is obviously more powerful than they are, even though he is also obviously less powerful than Danny. And so I don't think the fact that he's in an in-between place makes it any less confusing that the hotel doesn't seem to care about him. The movie goes an entirely different route and implies that Jack is the one that it wants, and Danny and his powers are merely in the way, which is a really different approach, to say the least. It further implies that Jack may be some sort of reincarnated caretaker for the hotel, which would be why he was in that photo. You know, it's not quite explained, so we don't know, but it does seem to be that Jack is the one that the hotel is after in the movie. As for the hotel itself and what its motivation is, the movie resorts to a vaguely defined and racist easy way out, which is to insinuate that the hotel was built on an old Indian burial ground. The book, as you may have guessed, is much more nuanced and complex. So throughout his work, Stephen King has this idea or belief or concept, call it what you will, that a place or thing absorbs the aura, whatever you want to call it, of evil things that take place inside or around it until, and if enough of those things happen, it will become a malevolent presence of its own. That happens throughout his books. Over time, it happens to the very towns of Castle Rock and Derry. So many bad things happen that it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. More bad things keep happening because it has so much spectral presence. You can see it with Christine in the book Christine. It comes up. It's a recurring concept throughout his work, and it is very perfectly embodied by the hotel, the Overlook, in The Shining. Basically, Stephen King has this idea that all hotels have ghosts, but the Overlook has had this really unseemly, extra violent history that has caused it to become what it is. And that is why Stephen King spends an inordinate amount of time in the book covering all of the violent things that have happened, all of the criminal characters who have come through the hotel and owned the hotel and manipulated its presence. I'd say the book's biggest flaw is that it could have used a lot of really judicious editing in those areas. But I think the reason Stephen King is doing it is that he wants to make clear that that is how the hotel became what it is. Those are the big differences. Let's talk about some odds and ends, little things that are definitely notable enough not to be kind of nitty-gritty things that I'm not going to go into. First is the haunted hotel room. In the book, Halloran tells Danny to avoid going into room 217 at all costs. In the movie, the room number is changed to 237, and I never actually knew why until I Googled it for this video. It is because the Timberline Hotel, which is what was used for the exterior shots of the movie, the interiors were all shot on a soundstage because, not to go in too deep, but Kubrick wanted the layout of the hotel not to make sense in the movie. So it is deliberately structured almost like a labyrinth. The layout doesn't quite make sense. You can never really orient yourself to where you are. And that could only be achieved by filming it on a soundstage. But he does use exteriors of the Timberline Hotel. The Timberline was worried that they would be just deluged with requests from guests to stay in room 217, so they asked the production to change it to 237 because they don't have a room 237. By all accounts, it didn't work. They still get requests for room 217. Next difference is the axe. Famously, in the movie, Jack pursues his family with an axe once he's gone over the edge, going so far as to hack his way into the bathroom where Danny and Wendy are hiding in one of the movie's most iconic and terrifying moments. But in the book, he has a roque mallet, and that is what he wields. Roque is an outdated version of croquet, basically because the hotel is so old. It has a roque court, not a croquet court, which seems unnecessarily complicated, but there it is. And a roque mallet may sound a lot less scary than an axe, but if you've read the book, you know about the brutal hammering that mallet is capable of, so you would never say it's not as scary. Another big difference, I mentioned we would get back to the hedge maze, and here we go. In the novel, the Overlook Hotel is surrounded by topiary animals that appear to move and follow people around throughout the course of the book. In the conclusion, they come fully to life and prowl the property with sinister intent. When Halloran arrives at the hotel, he is nearly captured and killed by the topiary animals while he tries to get back into the hotel to save Danny and Wendy. When the hotel explodes, the topiary animals burn up, which allows Halloran to get Danny and Wendy safely outside of the hotel to his vehicle and back down the mountain. The movie drops the topiary animals completely, most likely due to special effects limitations of the time that the movie was made. Also possibly because I think that's something that works on the page but can come across weird on screen, which is evidenced by the TV movie adaptation of The Shining, which Stephen King was heavily involved in and was a much more faithful adaptation of the book, which included the topiary animals. And my memory is that the topiary animals felt really cartoonish and bizarre when you see them on screen. It works on the page in the book, but it felt weird on screen. Instead, Kubrick substitutes a vast hedge maze outside the hotel, which became one of the film's signatures. Most people I've spoken to who have not read the book are completely dumbfounded when they find out that the hedge maze is not in the book, because they just can't understand how The Shining works without the hedge maze. Now, we've talked a little bit about Jack's process of seduction and his deterioration into madness, but one of the things that's really interesting is that in the novel, there's a better explanation for how he becomes seduced and manipulated by the hotel. In the movie, the deterioration is rapid and virtually inexplicable. He just feels at home in the hotel, and he quickly comes to take pride in his role as its caretaker. His writing is crippled by writer's block at the hotel, which is revealed when Wendy finds his manuscript, and it's just page after page after page of "all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy," a phrase that does not appear in the book. And you guessed it, the novel is a lot more nuanced and complex. Jack is indifferent to the hotel when they first arrive there. What changes is that he starts to look at it as a device for his writing. After discovering a scrapbook in the boiler room that the hotel deliberately put in his path, or so we find out later, Jack decides that the hotel's unseemly history would be a terrific source for a book. And he sees that as his path to being a successful writer. He is super ambitious about becoming a famous writer. I mean, think Ladder to the Sky by John Boyne. That is Jack Torrance on the page. And he sees the Overlook as a tool to his success. He gets tied to the hotel because it has value to him. Before they get snowed in, he goes to the library in the town at the bottom of the mountain and he researches the hotel. He spends a lot of time on it. He starts to feel protective of the hotel for this very reason, because he sees it as the tool to his success as a writer. And later, in his confusion, that translates to a more literal protectiveness of the building itself. In fact, part of how Jack is seduced by the hotel in the book is because it releases the writer's block that had been plaguing him because of his alcoholism, and then because of his shame over the disgrace of losing his job as at the college. And then shame over what's going to happen to his family and fear. The hotel releases all of that. In the first half of the book, he can't stop writing, and he feels that it's the hotel's energy that is helping him do that over time. Now, speaking of which, let's talk about the differences in the idea of redemption and forgiveness. The Jack Torrance in the novel has every reason to believe that everything's going to be just fine in the end. I mean, sure, he broke his son's arm in a drunken rage. Sure, his wife nearly left him. And he remains unsure of their future together. And sure, he lost his job after allowing his temper to come out, and after he viciously beats an entitled student who was disgruntled about getting kicked out of the debate team. But the novel's Jack has a guardian angel, which was a former drinking buddy named Al Shockley, who has gotten sober himself and wants to help his friend out. Significantly, Al Shockley is on the board of both the Overlook Hotel and the college where Jack had been fired. Al Shockley had Jack Torrance placed as the caretaker at the Overlook Hotel, despite the protests of the hotel's manager, who thinks Jack is a little too much of a wild card And Al Shockley tells Jack that if he takes this job and does well with it, read, if Jack lies low, continues to get sober and work on sober living, and finishes writing the play that he's had such a hard time finishing over the years, Shockley can take that time and that success and use it to convince the college to rehire Jack Torrance. Especially if he finishes the play and starts getting it produced, it will be another feather in his bonnet to convince the college to hire him back. The movie's Jack has no such guardian angel, and he's much more firmly at rock bottom. You could argue that this is why he seems unhinged when the movie begins, but I think the movie's not doing anything to give that argument any weight, to be honest. Furthering the divide along the notion of redemption and forgiveness, in the movie, Danny's attack in room 217 or 237 in the movie is the final breaking point for the family. Wendy suspects Jack. Jack feels injured by that suspicion even after he's vindicated, and they're antagonists for the rest of the movie. In the book, Wendy and Jack find a path back together and try to unite to get out of the hotel and to get Danny to safety. This is actually one of the novel's weaker points because it kind of strains credulity that Wendy doesn't do much to resolve that idea. She basically leaves it to Jack, who, unbeknownst to her, starts sabotaging any way that they could possibly get out of the hotel. Still, the fact remains that in the book, there's a way out, so to speak, for Wendy and Jack's relationship. Now let's talk about the twins. One of the movie's most indelible images is of the twin daughters of Delbert Grady. Delbert Grady was the former caretaker of the hotel who viciously murdered his family before committing suicide himself. In the movie, you see the twins holding hands in a hallway, calling to Danny, telling them to play with him, intercut with shots of their murdered bodies, which is pretty gruesome. That doesn't happen in the book, nor does the iconic image of blood pouring from the elevators. Delbert Grady does show up as a ghost in the book, but you never see his family at all. And it is not the crucial moment in Jack becoming unhinged that it is in the movie either. So those are all the differences that I'm going to cover. Let's talk about which one is better. And it's a really tough question because both of them are good, but both of them have definite faults. Really, both incarnations are trying to achieve very different things, so it's nearly impossible to do a one-to-one comparison of them. If you take the movie on its own and not as an extension of the book, it's great. The opposite is true of the book. Both of them are better off looked at as completely separate entities. Having said that, if you told me that I had to either watch the movie or read the book again, I'd watch the movie. The book's biggest flaw, which is that it could have used some judicious editing and streamlining, is ultimately more of a deal breaker for me than the movie's oversimplification. Having read the book twice before, I know that I can take the additional context that the book provides into the movie with me. However, as for you, if you've only seen the movie, I would tell you to read the book. If you've only read the book, I would tell you to read the movie. If you have done neither, I would point you to the book first before you watch the movie. How's that for a complicated answer? Anyway, that is a lot about The Shining. Probably more than you can handle. So if you've made it to this point, I really appreciate it. Thank you for your time and your diligence. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have comments, thoughts, considerations, leave them down below. If you want to talk about the TV adaptation, which I've completely ignored for good reason, I think, you can talk about that down below to your heart's content. If you have ideas about how the adaptation of Dr. Sleep factors into all of this, I would love to hear it because I am interested. I just don't know when I'm going to get around to reading this because that is, oh boy, over 500 pages. So we'll see. Maybe someday. But for now, you may have heard my babies pacing around me. That's because it's their dinner time, so I better take care of them. As always, thank you for your time watching this video. Ooh. And she did not want to be held because she's hungry. So, as always, thank you for taking the time to watch this video. It's really appreciated. And I will be back. Until then, happy reading.